Decathlon is transforming and evolving. It's still that great store where you can go to buy a bike for everyone at entry-level prices. But for some time now, it's also the place where you can find high-performance bikes. At the time of recording this video, they have one of their Van Rysel road bikes, which is no coincidence, as the Vuelta a España leader, thanks to Ben O'Connor's work. And in the mountains, in the field of maximum performance, they have already spent 2 years with this 940S competing with the Rockrider for Racing team in the World Cup and achieving several podiums. So now that it's already on sale, let's get to know all its details. Join me. Decathlon's philosophy for all products is to offer the highest quality at the same cost to consumers. This philosophy is reflected in several aspects of the frame's manufacturing, which we will now explore. To begin with, here we have a double suspension, that's obvious, but in this case it's a single pivot with flex in the stays and just one linkage. It's the simplest system on the market today, but that doesn't diminish its effectiveness. In fact, other top brands like Scott or Specialized still use it today. But it's true that this is a system that will give us very few headaches when it comes to maintenance. It will make things easier for us if we're not very familiar with the world of suspension, to learn how to properly set up the bike, and on the other hand, it helps Carlona keep the cost of reduction in check. And also an interesting detail, which is, take a look, like everything. The rear swing arm is completely asymmetrical, and this will give extra lateral stiffness to the entire rear triangle, especially in very technical areas. Another thing to keep in mind is that Rockrider uses carbon in the entire front triangle and the entire rear triangle. However, the linkage and shock extender are 100% aluminum in this model. And finally, we have the cable entry on the side of the head tube. In this case, it's a very simple system, requires little maintenance, and it's going to lower your mechanic's labor bill. It will be lower compared to other more complex systems that hide the cables more, but require, well, more time to work on them. As you can see, every time the engineers at Rockriders from Decathlon had to choose between the more difficult and expensive option or the simpler and more effective one, they've always gone with the second option. So I think this bike could be a really good recommendation for anyone who wants to take their first step into a full suspension bike. A high-end competition model, and still has, let's say, a long way to go in terms of learning how these machines work. Let's talk about geometries now, but first of all, remember that this bike has been designed and in fact already comes standard with suspension with 120 millimeters, both front and rear. So what if we look at the chart where we compare it with other possible competitors? The World Cup and stores both feature 120 millimeter. Well, let's see that this bike in practically every parameter is within what would be the current standards for 120 millimeter dual suspension mountain bikes. Nowadays with a relatively long reach. Quite long actually, which is balanced out with a shorter stem. And then a head tube angle that in this case is extremely slack, even below 67 degrees. And that on paper should help us tackle very fast or extremely steep descents. Technical descents more easily. I had a pretty good time, pushed to the limit, the 120 millimeters of travel on the bike. How does it go downhill? Well, the feeling has been interesting. Let's start with the rear part, because as you can see, all this symmetry we see in the chainstay area, the seat stays have added reinforcement, which may not be the most aesthetically pleasing. However, I can assure you that they serve their purpose, because you can feel that the rear part of the bike is extremely stiff, especially laterally, so it's very hard to lose the rear end of the bike. And that's something I've especially liked. Then, on the other hand, as you can see, the frame's looping is amazing. As a bar, the top bar drops a lot, and this allows you to do certain descents If you need to move your knee to the other side or over the top bar, it's very easy, so it gives you a very interesting maneuverability. And there's a part of the bike, the front part, where I found some gray areas that I wanted to discuss with you, because as you've seen in that geometry chart, the bike's reach is much longer compared to other competitors, and the head angle is also very slack. Well, I've confirmed that this doesn't just happen with this bike, but also with others that I've been able to test. When this combination appears, head angles beyond 67 degrees and reach that's a bit longer than the standard. Let's put it this way. The bike feels super stable at very high speeds. I mean, you could do one of those mega avalanches, and the faster you go, the more stable the bike feels when there's a lot of steep terrain. Also, let's say everything that has to do with keeping the handlebars straight. There, the bike is a beast and makes any of us a better cyclist, a better biker. However, these are bikes that feel extremely sluggish. They even take you to a point of imbalance. In situations where you have to maneuver at very low speeds and you really have to turn the handlebars at some point, even if it's just a little, like the typical area that's more technical, that requires more work, more similar to what trial riding would be. There, this bike feels clumsy. Every bike has its strengths and weaknesses depending on the terrain, so it's not inherently good or bad. What I'm trying to do is convey to you, in case you're considering buying it, what type of terrain you're really going to excel on. Strava segments, yes. Are you buying this bike? And it's clear that these are all those segments where there's a lot of speed and the handlebars don't move from the straight position. Now let's discuss one of the issues that appears to concern you greatly. At least that's what you've told me in the first post I've made about this bike on Instagram, which is the weight. Let's look at the numbers. This frame in size M, without the shock, weighs 1,670 grams. And the complete bike, just as you get it in the store, is just under 12 kilos. Taking into consideration that it is a 120 millimeter setup front and rear, and that it comes with the level of components it has. When you factor in the price along with the weight, the overall value becomes even more appealing. Because this bike used to cost 4,500 euros, but Decathlon recently adjusted its price, and now the price of this bike is definitely set at 4,000 euros. Even with all that, there might still be someone who says it could be a bit heavy. Remember that the weighing was done on the bike as it is delivered to you in the store, as I mentioned earlier. That means without pedals, without bottle cages, but not tubeless, so with an inner tube inside the tires. The moment you go tubeless, depending on the amount of sealant you use, you'll probably take off around 200 grams from the bike. Let's proceed with the component review. There's an intriguing topic to discuss, but first, let's examine how this model is assembled. Specifically, to start, we have the latest generation GXT type wireless transmission with the new 1052 cassette, which offers much smoother gear progression, especially in the last jump. And here we also have a 34-tooth single chainring with 170mm cranks for sizes S and M and 175mm for sizes L and extra large. All the suspensions are from RockShox. To start, here we have a seat base of 120mm with 35mm wide bars. So we're going to have good stiffness there, and here in the back as well, a Siglax Ultimate shock absorber with 120mm. The wheels are very interesting because it comes standard with Reynolds carbon wheels with 30mm of internal width on the front wheel and 28 on the rear. The dropper post, let me see if I say it right, is a Transex with 120mm of travel. We have a super comfortable Physic Argo as the saddle, and the stem and handlebar are aluminum from the brand itself, Rockrider. And what else can I tell you? Well, especially about the tires, it comes with Hutchinson Kraken in 2.30, which personally is a tire I've used a lot over thousands of kilometers, and it's a super balanced option to use on a mountain bike. And I think it's a great decision that they include them as standard. And finally, I want to mention the brakes. Surprisingly, it comes with TRP double piston brakes with 2 pistons in each caliper. And as you can see, they have 180mm diameter discs in the front and 160 in the rear. For those obsessed with weight, I'll tell you that this obviously isn't the top of the line model. There's a higher one that comes with pretty much the lightest components you can find on the market. And it costs 6,500 euros. Which is still a very competitive price for a high-end model, considering how the market is right now. Now, there's something I'd like you to consider, Says, and that's that this bike, which costs 4,000 euros, has exactly the same frame as the top-of-the-line model. There isn't that difference in carbon quality that you do find with other brands, and therefore you're not spending as much as you would on the high-end model. You can get this bike and then over time gradually make improvements, which is relatively easy. If you want to make it lighter and make it more competitive in that sense, then change the stem. An aluminum handlebar for a carbon cockpit or a dropper post that's more competitive in terms of weight. The fork, etc. But making the investment over time in installments little by little, so well, it's something to keep in mind that in other brands you can't find the same type of carbon in the frame. So that's another option I leave on the table in the riding section, specifically climbing. How does this bike perform when climbing? The truth is that the initial feeling it gave me is positive. On one hand, I find it quite responsive, which, as I said, is a good thing for me. For a racing bike, it's agile for being a 120 and having such a slack head angle. Is it well achieved in this sense? Then there's a downside. And that is, like every single pivot, it's doomed to be understood. With a 3-position control, in this case you have here a 3-position grip control. The fully open one, intermediate and closed. And well, honestly, I think the kinematics in this sense are not worked on at all. It completely overshadows that intermediate position of the lock control in an attempt to fix all that contamination. From the pedaling that comes from the chain to the suspension. Nothing we don't already know, something that already happens, as I said, in the vast majority of single pivot bikes, but well, it's just a matter of getting used to it. Just keep it in mind, it's time to go downhill. These details I'm about to mention are also interesting and important when considering a purchase. Universal derailleur hanger on the rear, and then we have a press fit bottom bracket. The seat tube measures 31.6, a universal size that makes finding a compatible seat post very easy. Ability to mount bottle cages, including double bottle cage, is crucial these days. And the topic of protections is also very interesting since it comes standard with a protection on the lower part of the down tube, which is usually a place that takes a lot of hits. The bike on the chainstay and on the swing arm itself. And finally, keep in mind that this bike is sold in these colors. As far as I know, it can be customized. Now let's move on to likely the most fascinating part of the video. The conclusions. Here I'm going to give you a surprise, and of course the pros and cons. The surprise for me has to do with the geometry. I expected Decathlon to be much more conservative in their approach, and yet finding a head angle beyond 67 degrees with these 66.5 and such a long reach. I know these are measurements we can find in many other brands, but honestly I expected Decathlon to be, well, something more balanced. And here they've aimed for their bike. Not only is it up to date today, but it will also last for many years in terms of geometry, in terms of staying relevant. Hats off to them, I was surprised. Next, the pros. The most obvious one, as always with Caldon bikes, we have to talk about the price of their bikes versus the components and the frame material you get. They're practically unbeatable in this sector. In this regard, on the other hand, I was very positively surprised by the performance of the brakes, TRP. You must say maybe that when we went over the components, there are people who say, I don't know this brand. Though not Shimano or SRAM, these brakes perform exceptionally well. Despite having only 2 pistons per caliper, the feel closely resembles that of Shimano XT brakes. They have a lot of power, a lot of braking bite, they dissipate heat relatively well. On long descents, they don't overheat, and the feel, like I said, is very similar to Shimano. So in this regard, hats off. Another advantage, in my opinion, is the choice of the suspension system. As I mentioned before, I think it's a good suspension system. Not only does it make life easier for those who are new to double suspension cross-country, but also an experienced person can always get the most out of a single pivot with flex stays and a linkage. So in this sense, I think sometimes I'm demanding with certain brands that have a lot of pedigree and that release single pivots. And that's it, bikes that look a lot like each other. Because I expect more from them. I expect those brands that supposedly have so much pedigree and so much development precisely innovate and create new things. More complex cushioning systems. However, I think Decathlon had to stick with a single pivot, and it was the best option they had. At least for this first high-performance model they've released to the market. Now let's move on to the cons, and let's start with the suspension lockout control, which in this case is wrist operated. A grip shift that personally I don't really like how it works, at least on a competition bike like the one we have here in front of us. This isn't a criticism of the bike. No matter where we put this component, for me to understand we're going to have this problem. But anyway, basically we have to make a really big gesture to move the controller up and down. A gesture that in the long run in a high intensity competition, also it can end up really tiring out the muscles in our forearm, hand, fingers and so on. Something that's not ideal. And on the other hand, every time we make this intense gesture, we're losing the grip of our left hand on the handlebar, especially in technical sections and so on. Well, I don't think it's something I would recommend. Something that can simply be solved with a lever control, and that's it. That said, the biggest contrast I can find related to the bike or to Decathlon is exactly the same one I found with the RCR from Van Rissel on the road. And that is, Decathlon is able to put bicycles up for sale at such a competitive price with such high-level components and such high-quality frames. In this case, 4,000 euros, we're talking about a bicycle. With this setup, which creates a very high demand. And so far, Decathlon hasn't been able to meet all that demand. So it's extremely difficult to walk into a Decathlon store and find even a single unit of the 940 available for sale. You have to order it, it takes time to arrive, and so on. And this also leads me to a thought that I think is very interesting, and that is that the day that Decathlon is able to meet all the demand they have for bicycles, both Van Rissel and Rockrider, it will be very good for the sector, very good for its users, even for those who don't buy or aren't users of Decathlon bicycles, because honestly, in recent years, the price of bicycles from traditional brands and others has skyrocketed. In some areas, in some specific cases, there are truly outrageous prices, and a real counterbalance is needed within this sector, a real counterbalance. Decathlon for now is offering it, but the day it is truly able to meet all that demand, that we go to marches, races, go out to the mountains, to the road, and we keep seeing this type of bicycle everywhere. Will that be when Decathlon has truly succeeded? Help the sector to balance itself a bit, and those brands that have such skyrocketing prices, especially in these mid-high ranges, will probably have to reconsider and lower their prices a bit. I think that reflection will be very positive when it finally happens, and I hope it doesn't take too long. Well, anyway, what do you guys think? From 1 to 10, what score would you give this bike? This 940S? Let me know in the comments, please. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please like it, as a lot of work went into making it. See you in the next videos. More reviews are coming, more bikes of all kinds. As always, I hope you're very happy. Bye.